your music is obviously influenced by many other musicians, and
Yeah.
please tell me something about the music you heard as a teenager, and how did you first came in contact with that music, and how does it feel?
Well, it goes back way before I was a teenager. It goes back to when I was like probably 7 or 8 or something like that. Maybe even before that. From probably like the mid-60s, even though I was only a little kid, but that was the first time I really sort of took notice of music, and it really affected me in a big way. And I think probably by sort of 1967, I started to take it really seriously and kind of got into the whole trip, really, the whole pop culture thing, really. So for me, you know, as much as I liked the record, I'd also like the band, the way they looked, and I liked their haircuts, I liked the attitude, I'd like what they'd say in interviews. And they might mention other artists who, in turn, I'd go and find those people, and I'd go like this and backtrack and find all the various sort of strands of it. But I mean, I bought into the whole thing, really, and I still do. I still bought into the whole pop culture thing, and I still believe in it now. I think, you know, for me, music changed my world anyway, and possibly changed the world as well to some extent. But it certainly changed lots of individuals' lives. And my life was never the same after I heard the Beatles. You know, that was it for me. That was the signal for me that life could be different. You know, life didn't just have to be this 2 up, 2 down suburban existence. Anything was possible. The world was a possibility then, after hearing the Beatles. And probably for most of the music of that time as well, you know, from the Kinks. But certainly the Beatles were the ignition for it all for me. Yeah, I liked pop music more than anything else, and I got my own messages out of pop music. Really, it wasn't necessarily overtly political, but I got something else from it culturally. Really. Well, I mean, from the Small Faces to the Kinks to the Young Rascals, Loving Spoonful, Beach Boys, the Fabs, obviously, Rolling Stones, the Who. You know, the list is endless, and there's a whole kind of soul thing as well, which, you know, I kind of got into from, probably I suppose from Motown, really, from like the Four Tops, you know. From like Reach Out, I'll Be There is probably like the first time, or the first sort of soul record, if you want to call it that I got into. And then James Brown, and then I got into reggae as well in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. And Stax, you know, I mean, it's just endless. It's, you know, and it's still unfolding to me, because however much I've heard and learnt about in the last 40, 50 years, there's much more out there. It's the tip of the iceberg often, I think, you know. So all the time I'm discovering, whether it's new music or old music, I'm discovering music I haven't heard before all the time, you know. It could be, you know, contemporary music or a record that was made 45 years ago, which I've never heard before. And it all does the same thing to me. It fills me with excitement and wonder, and again, you know, I'm still, even at my age now, it still opens up the world to me, and what I could do and what possibilities I've got within myself as well.
Okay, I tried to.
And that's the power of good music. I think that's what good music does to people.
I think your new album sounds like a pure rock and roll album. Would you agree? And why is it that rocky?
We just felt, me and the producer Simon Dine, who's the fellow who produced the record and co-wrote all the songs, we just wanted to make some music that we weren't hearing anymore, at the moment anyway. And at least on English radio, it's just become very tame and very safe sounding. So we wanted to make something that was going to kind of hopefully make people sit up and listen again, really. To make something kind of urgent and with energy and raw sounding. That was the idea behind it anyway, yeah. Everything we know now was being created at that time, you know. And so it must have been like frontier land, really. It was kind of, there was no barriers. It was just wherever you wanted to plough, you could do. You could go there and take the audience with you. And it must have been pretty exceptional, I thought, really. It was easier for us all now because we know so much about pop history, because there's so much been written about it, and we've had 40 years plus to look at it, study it, listen to it. It's hard for us to imagine what it would be like to hear it for the very, very first time, you know.
When you hear that music first time, maybe the Beatles, what do you feel?
it was something I'd never heard before, and it just sort of instantly turned me on. And probably by the time I was sort of 8 or 9, I wanted to be in a band as well. You know, I'd be one of the kids who'd be watching Top of the Pops every Thursday night, and maybe very occasionally buying a copy of the NME. And I was just become obsessed with it, really. I was obsessed with clothes and music. I mean, that was kind of the culture I come from. That was all there was. There was that and football. And there wasn't too much else, really. But it was enough. So I could never, ever separate those things, really. They were kind of... I was into the music and I was also into the clothes as well. And they all went hand in hand to me. There used to be 2 boutiques in Woking, as they used to call them in them days. And I would just go and stand for ages looking into the window, just marvelling at, it looks like Aladdin's cave, really, of all these fantastic clothes which you could never afford, but just looking at them anyway. But to me it was just part of the same thing. The music and the clothes and the whole attitude was all part of the same thing. Still is for me, really.
Can we talk about fashion? Well, how important is fashion for the pop music? Fashion, or let's say outfit, image?
Well, it was. I don't think you could separate the two things. You know, from the time I was influenced from the 60s, probably into the 70s. It's probably different now, because I don't know if there's that same sense of tribalism now these days. But probably for me and my generation, I don't know if you'd separate the two things. Kind of, if you're into a certain style of music, you're automatically into a certain way of dressing. For instance, when we were into when we were sort of post-skinhead sort of time, sort of early 70s, we would only listen to black music, and everyone I knew was a skinhead or a suedehead, whatever we called ourselves at the time. Everyone at the football dance would be dressed in the same way, you know. And anyone, if you weren't into that, you were walking around school in a great army grey coat thing with long hair and a copy of Pink Floyd under your arm, you know. There was only 2 camps, there was no in between. Anyone who was in between didn't do either, weren't worth talking to. That's the way it was.
Do you have an own memory about a mind-blowing experience with music?
Probably Strawberry Fields Forever for me, from like early 67. Because I was too young to think about psychedelics or acid and all that stuff. It was just a bit of music to me, but it was just so colourful and so otherworldly that even at sort of whatever age I was, 7, 8, whatever I was at the time, 7, was just like, wow, to hear that come out of the transistor radio was just was mind blowing, actually, even at my tender age. But and a lot of those records from that time, which we probably call like psychedelic pop now, but even things like See Emily Play by the Pink Floyd, were just, and Hole in My Shoe, Traffic, stuff like that, were so colourful, you know. A lot of English psychedelic music also had this kind of childlike imagery in it as well, which I guess appealed to a lot of the pop kids like me, as you know, at the time, who didn't know about the psychedelics and all that stuff. You know what I mean?
An incident that marks, for you, a personal incident that marks the beginning of pop in that years. You can say it.
Well,
for me, this is the moment. Pop. This is the birth of pop.
For me, the Beatles goes back to them again, and that kind of. I mean, the Beatles revolutionised the world. I think. I still believe that. I think they changed everyone's attitudes, really, young or old, really. I think one way or the other. And I mean, when they first started off, they were kind of very much sort of. Everyone liked them. The mums and dads liked them as much as the kids did. And by the mid '60s, they kind of become to represent more the young people. But for me, they kind of, they changed everything. They made, I mean, everything was happening probably culturally anyway at the same time, but they made the world colourful, I think. They made the world sort of technicolour, and I think it was probably quite drab, black and white world before that. So I know some people sort of would say Elvis Presley, but for me, my age group, it was the Fabs, the Beatles. I think they revolutionised the world. I think they're kind of, put them on too much of a lofty stool, but I think they're kind of disciples in lots of ways, really, prophets in lots of ways. for me anyway.
Um,